The sun cast its final rays across the dusty plains of Bentonville, Wyoming Territory. 1873. When Abigail Gardner's trembling hands reached for the worn journal hidden beneath her mattress, the only place her thoughts could find voice since her father had stolen her spoken words. Like the wildflowers that somehow survived the harsh frontier climate, Abigail's spirit remained unbroken despite years of silence, waiting only for someone to hear the things she could not say. No one in Bentonville questioned why Judge Elijah Gardner's 20-year-old daughter never spoke. Most assumed she was simple-minded or touched by God in some peculiar way. The townsfolk nodded respectfully when she passed, their eyes filled with pity that burned Abigail more than her father's cruel backhand ever could. She wasn't simple or touched, she was imprisoned in silence by the man who should have protected her above all others. Abigail remembered her voice clearly, remembered singing to her mother as she lay dying of fever 5 years ago. She remembered the sound of her own laughter, remembered how words once flowed easily from her lips like water from a spring. But that had been before her father decreed that her words were dangerous, her opinions unseemly, her very voice an affront to his authority as both father and the most powerful man in the county. The first time he had struck her for speaking out of turn had been 3 days after her mother's funeral. The second time, a week later, when she dared question his decision to sell her mother's cherished piano to pay for whiskey. By the 3rd month of such treatment, Abigail's voice had retreated so deep within her that she couldn't find it anymore, even when she tried. Judge Gardner, for his part, told anyone who asked that his daughter's affliction was a mysterious ailment that had taken hold after her mother's passing. A nervous condition, he would explain with practiced concern, brought on by feminine fragility and grief. The town doctor, who owed his position to the judge's influence, nodded along with this explanation whenever it was offered. On this particular evening, as Abigail wrote feverishly in her journal by candlelight, she heard the commotion of horses arriving at the sprawling Gardner house on the hill overlooking Bentonville. Her father was hosting yet another dinner for the territory's influential men, bankers, ranchers, and politicians, whose favor he cultivated with fine brandy and promises of judicial lenience. A knock at her bedroom door caused her to hastily shove the journal back into its hiding place. "Miss Abigail," called Martha, the housekeeper, "your father requests your presence downstairs to serve the gentlemen there after dinner drinks." Abigail straightened her simple blue dress, checked her appearance in the small mirror above her washbasin, and resigned herself to another evening of silent service. Her father enjoyed displaying his dutiful, silent daughter to his guests, a living testament to his authority and control. Descending the stairs, Abigail felt the weight of unfamiliar eyes upon her. Among her father's usual associates sat a stranger whose weathered face and sun-darkened skin marked him as someone who worked the land rather than profited from it. He stood out among the soft-handed businessmen like a hawk among pigeons. "Ah, here she is," Judge Gardner announced. "My dear Abigail, come pour Mr. Novak a drink. He's brought us news from the northern ranges." The stranger, Mr. Novak, nodded politely as she approached with the crystal decanter. Unlike the other men who typically looked through her as if she were a piece of furniture, his eyes met hers directly, with an intensity that nearly caused her to drop the expensive vessel. "Thank you, Miss Gardner," he said, his voice carrying the slight rasp of someone accustomed to giving commands across open country. Abigail nodded, her customary response to any address, and moved to serve the other men. As she circulated around the room, she could feel Mr. Novak's gaze following her, not with the leering interest some of her father's associates displayed, but with curiosity and something else she couldn't identify. As I was saying, Judge, the banker, Mr. Whitmore, continued their earlier conversation, these cattle rustlers are becoming increasingly bold. 3 of my clients have lost significant portions of their herds in the past month alone. The territorial marshal's office is understaffed, Judge Gardner replied smoothly, which is why I've suggested to Governor Campbell that we employ private solutions for these problems. The conversation continued, with Abigail standing silently in the corner as was expected of her, but her attention remained fixed on the stranger. His name, she had gathered, was Yates Novak. Unlike her father's associates with their expensive suits and carefully groomed appearances, Mr. Novak wore practical clothing clean but worn at the edges, and his dark hair was tied back at the nape of his neck. The calluses on his hands told of hard work, and the way he sat alert, balanced, ready spoke of someone accustomed to danger. Mr. Novak comes highly recommended, Judge Gardner was explaining. He's tracked rustlers from Montana to New Mexico territory. His methods are effective. Not so much a bounty hunter as a problem solver, Mr. Novak clarified, his voice carrying a note of correction that few dared use with the judge. I find stolen property and return it to its rightful owners. Sometimes that means bringing in those responsible, sometimes not. Abigail noticed her father's momentary flash of irritation at being corrected, but watched with interest as he quickly masked it with a politician's smile. Her father feared this man, she realized with surprise, or at the very least, respected him enough to tolerate his directness. Indeed, Judge Gardner recovered. And we're fortunate to have your expertise, Mr. Novak. The ranchers will sleep easier knowing you're on the trail. As the evening wore on, Abigail remained in her silent role, occasionally refilling glasses or removing empty plates. When at last the guests began to depart, she stood in the foyer as propriety demanded, her eyes downcast as each man offered perfunctory goodbyes to the judge's peculiar daughter. When Yates Novak's turn came, he paused longer than the others had. "Miss Gardner," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Sometimes the things we don't say speak the loudest." Her eyes flew to his in surprise, but he had already turned away, shaking her father's hand and accepting an invitation to return the following day to discuss the details of his employment. After the door closed behind the last guest, Judge Gardner turned to Abigail with narrowed eyes. "I noticed Novak paying you particular attention," he said, his voice carrying that dangerous edge she had learned to fear. "Remember your place, girl. Men like him don't look at silent, damaged goods like you without the basest intentions." Abigail lowered her gaze and nodded, the familiar gesture of submission that had become her language of survival. "Go to your room. I have work to attend to." Climbing the stairs to her bedroom, Abigail's mind raced with thoughts of the strange cowboy whose eyes had seemed to see through her silence to the screaming beneath. For the first time in years, she felt the smallest flicker of something dangerous ignite within her chest hope. Morning arrived with the sound of horses and men's voices in the yard below Abigail's window. Peering through the curtains, she saw Yates Novak mounted on a magnificent dun stallion, speaking with her father and several ranchers. Maps were spread across an improvised table, and the men gestured toward the surrounding hills. Martha knocked on her door. "Miss Abigail, your father says you're to pack a basket of food for the men riding out today." In the kitchen, Abigail worked methodically, preparing sandwiches, boiled eggs, and apple tarts for the search party. As she wrapped each item carefully in wax paper, she wondered about the mysterious cowboy who had spoken to her so strangely the night before. She carried the heavy basket to the yard, where the men were preparing to mount up. Her father intercepted her before she could approach the group. "Give it here," he commanded, taking the basket from her hands. "No need for you to embarrass yourself or me with your condition in front of these men." The familiar humiliation burned her cheeks as she stepped back, eyes lowered. But as her father delivered the basket to the waiting riders, she felt someone watching her and glanced up to find Yates Novak's gaze fixed upon her once again. He nodded once, a gesture so slight it might have been imagined, before turning his horse and leading the group down the lane toward the open range. 3 days passed before Abigail saw Yates Novak again. She was in town with Martha, purchasing supplies at the general store when the search party returned. Their arrival caused a stir as townspeople gathered to hear news of the rustlers. From her position near the store's window, Abigail could see Novak dismounting, his movements betraying fatigue but not defeat. The ranchers who had accompanied him seemed jubilant, clapping each other on the back as they led several unfamiliar men with bound hands toward the sheriff's office. "Well, I'll be," Martha murmured beside her. "Looks like that Mr. Novak found the thieves after all. Your father will be pleased." Abigail nodded absently, her attention fixed on the tall figure now standing alone as the crowd dispersed. As if sensing her gaze, Yates Novak turned toward the store window, his eyes finding hers through the glass with unerring accuracy. The intensity of his gaze sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. He approached the store and Abigail quickly turned away, busying herself with examining bolts of fabric she had no intention of purchasing. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. "Miss Gardner," he greeted, removing his hat. His voice carried no surprise at finding her there, as though he had known she would be. Martha looked between them with undisguised curiosity. "Mr. Novak, congratulations on your success. The judge will want to hear all about it, I'm sure." "Thank you, madam," he replied politely, but his eyes remained on Abigail. "Miss Gardner, I wonder if I might impose on you for assistance in selecting a suitable gift for my sister back in Colorado. A woman's opinion would be invaluable." Martha looked uncertainly at Abigail, aware of her inability or unwillingness to speak. "Perhaps I could help instead, Mr. Novak. Miss Abigail doesn't. I understand Miss Gardner communicates in her own way," he interrupted smoothly. "Sometimes the best advice comes without words." Before Martha could protest further, Abigail nodded her agreement and moved toward the display of ladies' handkerchiefs and gloves near the back of the store. Novak followed, leaving Martha hovering uncertainly near the counter. "My sister's birthday approaches," he said conversationally as they stood side by side examining the merchandise. His voice dropped lower. "Though in truth, I have no sister, Miss Gardner. I merely wanted a moment to speak with you." Abigail's fingers froze above a lace-trimmed handkerchief, her heart suddenly pounding. "I've made inquiries about you in town," he continued, still feigning interest in the goods displayed before them. "People say you haven't spoken in nearly 5 years, since your mother's passing. They believe you can't speak." He paused, then added softly, "But I believe you won't speak. There's a difference." She darted a glance at his face, finding his expression serious but kind. "I've seen this before," he said. "In my travels, I encountered a young Cheyenne boy who had witnessed his family's massacre. He didn't speak for 2 winters afterward, though there was nothing physically wrong with him. The trauma had sealed his voice inside him." Abigail felt tears threatening and blinked rapidly to dispel them. No one had ever suggested that her silence might be something other than a permanent condition, something that could perhaps be overcome. "I leave tomorrow to track another group of rustlers further north," Novak said, "but I'll return to Bentonville within a fortnight, if you wish to correspond." You might leave a note in the hollow of the old oak at the crossroads past your father's property." She stared at him in shock, unable to process what he was suggesting. "These gloves will do nicely for my sister," he said in a louder voice, clearly intended for Martha's benefit. "Thank you for your assistance, Miss Gardner." With that, he selected a pair of fine leather gloves, paid for his purchase, and departed the store with a polite nod to both women, leaving Abigail trembling with a mixture of fear and possibility. That night, as her father boasted of how his choice of tracker had led to the swift capture of the rustlers, Abigail thought of the hollow tree and what it might mean to place words, their real words, her words, that someone else might read and understand. The risk was enormous. If her father discovered such an act of defiance, his retribution would be severe. Yet the pull of potential connection after years of isolation was stronger than her fear. The next morning, after her father left for court, Abigail slipped a small folded paper into her pocket and told Martha she wished to walk in the gardens. Once out of sight of the house, she made her way to the boundary of the property and beyond, to the crossroads where the ancient oak stood, its massive trunk split by a lightning strike decades ago, creating a perfect natural hiding place. Her hands shaking, she pushed the paper into the hollow and hurried back toward home, half terrified and half exhilarated by her own daring. The note contained only 5 words: "I have not always been silent." For the next 2 weeks, Abigail found herself watching the road from her bedroom window, anticipating Yates Novak's return with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her. She had never felt this way about anyone, this sense that someone might see past her silence to the person trapped within. Finally, on a late afternoon when golden light bathed the landscape, she spotted a familiar figure riding toward town. Without thinking, she grabbed her shawl and slipped out of the house while Martha was busy preparing dinner, heading toward the crossroads at a pace that wouldn't draw attention but betrayed her urgency. The oak tree stood as it had for centuries, patient and enduring. Approaching it with caution, Abigail peered into the hollow and felt her heart leap at the sight of a folded paper tucked inside. She withdrew it with trembling fingers and unfolded it to read. "I believe you have much to say, Miss Gardner. Will you meet me at Widow Jenkins' bookshop tomorrow at 3? She is discreet and kind." Abigail pressed the note to her chest, her mind racing. The widow's bookshop was a respectable establishment, and Mrs. Jenkins was indeed known for her kindness and independence. It would be possible to visit during her regular trips to town with Martha, though arranging to be there at precisely 3 o'clock would require some careful maneuvering. The following day, Abigail convinced Martha that she needed new thread for her embroidery, timing their errands so they would be near the bookshop at the appointed hour. Once there, she managed to communicate through gestures that she wished to browse the books alone while Martha completed other purchases. "Very well," Martha agreed reluctantly. "I'll meet you back here in half an hour. Don't wander off now, Mrs. Jenkins greeted her warmly as she entered the shop. "Miss Gardner, how lovely to see you. Mr. Novak mentioned you might stop by. He's in the reading alcove at the back." Surprised by the widow's open acknowledgement of their arrangement, Abigail made her way through the shelves to a small, secluded area lined with comfortable chairs. Yates Novak stood when she appeared, gesturing to a seat opposite his own. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "I wasn't certain you would." Abigail sat, acutely aware of how improper this meeting would appear to anyone who knew of it, a young, unmarried woman meeting privately with a man not related to her. But Mrs. Jenkins' shop felt like a sanctuary, and the risk seemed worth taking. "I think I understand something of what happened to you," Novak continued when she remained silent. Your father is known throughout the territory as a man of influence and strict principles. Some admire him for it, others fear him." He leaned forward slightly. "The Cheyenne boy I told you about, he found his voice again through drawing. When he couldn't speak of what he had witnessed, he drew it instead. First with sticks in the dirt, then with charcoal on hide. Eventually, the drawings became stories, and the stories became words again." Abigail listened intently, wondering where this was leading. "I don't know if you enjoy drawing, Miss Gardner, but I thought perhaps." He reached into his saddlebag and produced a small slate board and chalk. "This might give your thoughts a way out when I'm not present to receive your notes." She stared at the offered items, understanding instantly what he was proposing. A means of communication that could be quickly erased, leaving no evidence for her father to discover. With hands that trembled slightly, she accepted the gift, feeling its weight both physical and symbolic. "Would you like to try it?" he asked gently. Abigail hesitated, then took the chalk and wrote carefully. "Why are you helping me?" Yates read her words and smiled slightly. "A fair question. I've spent most of my life tracking people who don't want to be found. I've developed an instinct for recognizing when someone is trapped or hiding. When I saw you at your father's house, I recognized something familiar, a person imprisoned not by walls, but by circumstances and the will of others." He paused, then added more softly, "No one deserves to live without a voice, Miss Gardner." She erased her first message and wrote again, "My father would be furious if he knew." "I understand the risk," Novak acknowledged. "I won't press you further than you're willing to go. But I'll be in Bentonville for at least another month, working for your father and the other ranchers. If you wish to continue our correspondence, I'll look for your messages in the oak." Their time was nearly up. Abigail could feel the minutes slipping away before Martha would return. She quickly erased the slate and wrote one more message. "Thank you for seeing me." Yates read it and nodded, his expression solemn. "You've always been visible, Miss Gardner, just not to those unwilling to truly look." As she prepared to leave, he added, "The slate will fit inside your embroidery basket or beneath a shawl. Mrs. Jenkins has agreed to hold any messages you might wish to leave for me if the oak becomes too risky." Abigail slipped the slate into her reticule just as Martha's voice called her name from the front of the shop. With a final glance at Yates Novak, she hurried away, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Over the following weeks, a dangerous dance began. Abigail would leave notes in the hollow oak when she could safely escape the house, and Yates would respond, sometimes the very same day. They exchanged thoughts about books they had read, observations about nature, and gradually, more personal reflections. In one note, Abigail finally explained what had happened. "My father believes women should be seen, not heard. After Mother died, he said my voice reminded him too much of hers. When I spoke, he would become enraged. The punishments grew worse until I learned that silence was safer. Now, even when I try, the words won't come." Yates' reply came the next day. "What was taken by force cannot be returned the same way. Your voice will come back when you feel safe enough to use it. Until then, your written words are just as powerful. You have not been silenced, merely forced to find a different way to speak." Their correspondence deepened as spring gave way to summer. Through her notes, Abigail revealed herself as intelligent, observant, and possessed of a quiet humor that had somehow survived years of suppression. Yates, in turn, shared stories of his travels across the territories, of the people and places he had encountered, and gradually of his own past. "I was orphaned at 12, he wrote in one note. "Raised by my uncle, a horse trader with a mean streak. Ran away at 16 and learned to track from an old Shoshone hunter who took pity on me. I've been wandering ever since, belonging nowhere and to no one. Their notes became a lifeline for Abigail, a connection to the world beyond her father's control. But as their friendship deepened, so did the danger of discovery. On a warm afternoon in early July, Abigail was returning from the oak tree when she spotted her father's carriage approaching unexpectedly from town. Panic seized her as she realized she couldn't reach the house without being seen. Quickly, she ducked behind a large bush at the side of the road, praying he wouldn't notice her. The carriage slowed as it passed her hiding place, and for a terrible moment, she thought he had seen her. But it continued on toward the house, and Abigail released the breath she'd been holding. That had been too close. Their means of communication would need to change. At their next meeting, carefully arranged through Mrs. Jenkins, Abigail explained the close call. "The oak is no longer safe," she wrote on her slate. "Father's schedule has become unpredictable." Yates frowned, considering. "Perhaps it's time we met somewhere else entirely. Somewhere your father would never think to look for you." He suggested Widow Miller's farm on the edge of town. The elderly woman had been kind to him when he first arrived in Bentonville, offering fresh vegetables from her garden and asking nothing in return. Her small property included an unused cabin where her son had once lived before moving to California. "Mrs. Miller is no friend of your father's," Yates explained. "He ruled against her in a property dispute years ago. She would take pleasure in providing us a safe meeting place, and she's discreet." Abigail hesitated, aware that meeting a man alone in a cabin crossed lines of propriety that even their current arrangement didn't breach. Yet the thought of losing their connection entirely was more frightening than the risk of discovery. "I can come on Tuesdays," she wrote finally. "Father holds court late, and Martha visits her sister." And so their new arrangement began. Each Tuesday afternoon, Abigail would tell Martha she was going to visit the pastor's wife to discuss charitable works, then make her way to Widow Miller's farm instead. The old woman would greet her with a knowing smile and a cup of tea, before directing her to the cabin where Yates waited. In the privacy of the small, rustic space, their communication deepened. Yates had brought books, novels, poetry, and newspapers from as far away as Denver, which they read together, with Abigail writing her thoughts and reactions on the slate. "I want to try something different today," Yates said during their fourth meeting at the cabin. "Something that might help your voice find its way back." Abigail looked at him questioningly. "The Cheyenne believe that singing is medicine for the spirit," he explained. "Not speaking, not even words, just sound. Would you try? No one can hear us here." Fear flashed across her face and she quickly wrote, "I don't think I can." "Not words," he clarified. "Just sound, like this." He demonstrated, humming a simple melody. Abigail stared at him, her chest tight with anxiety. The very thought of producing any voluntary sound terrified her. Her silence had become armor, protection against her father's rage. "Try closing your eyes," Yates suggested gently. "Pretend you're alone." She shook her head, writing, "It's not that simple." "I know," he acknowledged, "but sometimes we need to face our deepest fears to overcome them. Your father took your voice because it gave you power. Taking it back, even in small ways, is an act of courage." Abigail considered his words, feeling the truth in them. Her silence had begun as survival but had become a prison of its own. With trembling hands she wrote, "What if I can't?" "Then we try something else," Yates answered simply. "The path back to your voice will be your own, Abigail. I'm just offering possibilities." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something about the intimacy of it gave her courage. She closed her eyes, feeling the safety of the cabin around her, the distance from her father, the presence of someone who truly saw her. Taking a deep breath, she opened her mouth and released the smallest sound, not a hum, not even a note, just a soft exhalation of air that carried the faintest vibration. It was barely audible, but it was intentional, and tears sprang to her eyes at this tiny victory over her fear. Yates didn't comment or praise, seeming to understand instinctively that drawing attention to the moment might shatter her fragile progress. Instead, he simply continued their earlier conversation about the book they had been reading, giving her space to process what had just occurred. As summer progressed into fall, their Tuesday meetings became the center of Abigail's existence. Under Yates' patient encouragement, she progressed from making small sounds to humming simple melodies, never with words, but with increasing confidence. Each small step was a victory over the fear that had silenced her for so long. On a crisp October afternoon, Abigail arrived at the cabin to find Yates more serious than usual. "I've received word of rustlers operating near the Montana border," he explained. "Your father and the ranchers want me to investigate. I'll be gone for at least 3 weeks." The news hit Abigail with unexpected force. She had become dependent on their meetings, on his presence in her life. The thought of losing that connection, even temporarily, filled her with dread. "When do you leave?" she wrote on the slate. "Tomorrow at first light," he replied, watching her face carefully. Abigail nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. She knew his work required travel. He had never pretended otherwise, but the prospect of returning to complete isolation weighed heavily upon her. "I have something for you," Yates said, reaching into his saddlebag. He produced a small journal bound in soft leather. "For your thoughts while I'm away. Mrs. Miller has agreed to keep it safe for you between visits." Abigail accepted the gift, running her fingers over the smooth cover. "I also wanted to tell you something before I go," he continued, his voice taking on an unfamiliar hesitancy. "These past months, watching you find your strength again, it's been one of the greatest privileges of my life." She looked up in surprise, her heart suddenly racing. "I've grown to care for you, Abigail," he admitted quietly. "More than I should, perhaps. More than is wise, given your situation and mine." She quickly wrote on her slate, "I care for you too." The simple declaration hung between them, charged with meaning and possibility, but also with the reality of their circumstances. She was still under her father's control, still unable to speak, still bound by the constraints of her life in Bentonville. He was a wanderer by nature and necessity, a man whose profession required freedom of movement and independence. "When I return," Yates said after a moment, "we should talk about the future, about possibilities." Abigail nodded, hope blossoming within her despite the uncertainty ahead. For the first time since her mother's death, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she might regain not just her voice, but her freedom as well. As they parted that day, Yates took her hand for the first time, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. The gesture was simple but profoundly intimate, a physical acknowledgement of the connection they had formed through words written and unspoken. 3 weeks, he promised. No longer. The days following Yates' departure stretched endlessly for Abigail. She continued her visits to Widow Miller's farm, spending quiet hours in the cabin with the journal he had given her, filling its pages with thoughts and feelings she had never before expressed. In her father's house, she maintained her customary silence and obedience, though it chafed more than ever now that she had glimpsed the possibility of another kind of existence. Judge Gardner, preoccupied with an important case involving land rights for the railroad, paid her little attention, for which she was grateful. On the 18th day after Yates' departure, as Abigail was helping Martha prepare dinner, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Looking out the kitchen window, she saw her father returning early from court, accompanied by Sheriff Dawson and 2 other men she didn't recognize. "Wonder what that's about," Martha murmured as they watched the men dismount and enter the judge's study through the side door. Abigail felt a flicker of unease but returned to her task, slicing vegetables for the stew. A few minutes later, her father's voice bellowed from the study. "Abigail, come here at once." The knife clattered from her suddenly nerveless fingers. Something in his tone, a familiar rage barely contained, sent a chill of dread through her. Martha gave her a concerned look as she wiped her hands and made her way to the study. The four men fell silent as she entered. Her father stood behind his desk, his face flushed with anger, while Sheriff Dawson looked uncomfortable, avoiding her gaze. The other two men, strangers in expensive suits, watched her with undisguised curiosity. "Explain this," her father demanded, throwing something onto the desk between them. With horror, Abigail recognized one of her notes to Yates, not from the journal, but one of their earlier exchanges left in the hollow oak. Her mind raced, trying to remember what that particular note had contained. Sheriff Dawson found this while investigating reports of suspicious activity near the crossroads, Judge Gardner continued, his voice dangerously controlled. Imagine his surprise when he recognized the handwriting as belonging to my supposedly mute daughter. Abigail stood frozen, unable to move or respond. "Who have you been corresponding with?" her father demanded. When she didn't answer, he slammed his fist on the desk. "Answer me, girl." The irony of demanding a verbal response from her after years of enforced silence might have been comical in other circumstances. Now, it only underscored the impossible situation she found herself in. "She can't answer you, Elijah," Sheriff Dawson said uncomfortably. "Or won't. Either way, she can write, can't she?" The judge cut him off, pushing paper and pen across the desk toward Abigail. "Write the name of the man you've been meeting with." Abigail remained motionless, unwilling to betray Yates even under her father's increasingly dangerous anger. "Very well," Judge Gardner said after a tense silence. "If you won't tell me voluntarily, there are other ways to discover the truth." He turned to the sheriff. "Post men at the crossroads. Whoever has been corrupting my daughter will return eventually, and when he does, I want him brought to me." "Now, Elijah," Sheriff Dawson began, "let's not be hasty. My daughter has been meeting clandestinely with some man," her father interrupted coldly. "Her virtue and my reputation are at stake. Would you have me ignore such an offense?" The sheriff subsided, and Abigail felt the last hope of protection slipping away. Her father dismissed the other men, instructing them to wait in the parlor while he dealt with family matters. When they were alone, Judge Gardner regarded her with cold fury. "5 years," he said quietly. 5 years of obedience and proper behavior. I thought you had finally learned your place, learned to control that willful streak you inherited from your mother." He shook his head in disgust. "Instead, you've been deceiving me, sneaking around with some man like a common harlot." Abigail flinched at his words but held her ground, refusing to show the fear that coursed through her. "You will remain in your room until I discover the identity of your correspondent," he continued. "Martha will bring your meals and the doors will be locked. If you have any sense of self-preservation left, you'll pray that I calm down before I find him." With that, he took her roughly by the arm and marched her upstairs to her bedroom. The key turned in the lock with a terrible finality, and Abigail sank onto her bed, mind racing with fear not for herself, but for Yates. If her father's men caught him returning to the oak tree or attempting to see her, the consequences would be severe. Judge Gardner's influence extended throughout the territory. He could have Yates arrested on false charges, tried in his own courtroom, and sentenced to prison or worse. She had to warn him somehow, had to find a way to communicate the danger. For 3 days, Abigail remained locked in her room, with only Martha's brief visits to break the monotony of her confinement. She had tried everything she could think of to escape. The window was too high to jump safely, the lock too solid to break, Martha too loyal to the judge to be persuaded to help. On the fourth morning, she heard commotion downstairs, men's voices raised in argument, the sound of furniture being moved roughly. Pressing her ear to the door, she strained to hear what was happening. "Search everywhere," her father's voice commanded. "He must have left evidence of their meetings." Abigail's blood ran cold. Had they caught Yates? Were they searching his belongings? She pounded on the door, desperate to know what was happening, but no one came. Hours passed in agony until finally, as dusk was falling, the key turned in her lock. Her father entered, his expression grimly triumphant. "Your cowboy friend put up quite a struggle," he said without preamble. "But he's in custody now, charged with trespassing, mail theft, and corrupting a minor." "I'm not a minor," Abigail wrote furiously on a piece of paper from her desk. "I'm 20 years old." Judge Gardner laughed coldly. "So she does remember how to communicate when it suits her purposes." He crumpled her note and tossed it aside. "Age is irrelevant. You are under my guardianship and protection. This man, this drifter, has taken advantage of your simple nature and manipulated you for his own entertainment." She shook her head vehemently, grabbing another sheet of paper to write. "He helped me. You're the one who silenced me." Her father read the words and his face darkened dangerously. "Is that what he told you? That I'm somehow responsible for your condition?" He seized her shoulders, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. "Your mother filled your head with nonsense about independence and women's rights. Look what it got her: an early grave. I tried to protect you from the same fate." Abigail wrenched away from his grasp, anger overcoming fear. She wrote rapidly. "Mother died of fever, and you've been lying to everyone about why I don't speak." For a moment, something like uncertainty flickered in the judge's eyes. Then his expression hardened again. "It doesn't matter now. Your friend Mr. Novak will stand trial tomorrow. Given the evidence we found at Widow Miller's farm, including a journal full of improper exchanges, he'll likely hang for his crimes." Abigail felt the world tilt beneath her. Hang? For what crime? Showing kindness to a silenced woman, teaching her to find her voice again. The injustice of it struck her with physical force, and something inside her, something that had been building for 5 long years, finally broke free. "No." The word emerged as little more than a whisper, raspy from disuse, but it was undeniably her voice. Both she and her father froze in shock at the sound. "What did you say?" he demanded, staring at her as though she'd performed some impossible feat. Abigail swallowed hard, feeling the strange sensation of her vocal cords awakening after years of dormancy. "No," she repeated, slightly louder this time. "You can't." Judge Gardner's face contorted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You little deceiver," he hissed. "You've been capable of speech all along." She shook her head, struggling to form more words. "Not until now. You took my voice." Each word was painful, scraping through her throat like broken glass, but the relief of speaking again after so long was worth the pain. Her father took a step back, visibly shaken by this development. For the first time in Abigail's memory, he seemed uncertain, off balance. "It doesn't matter," he said finally, recovering his composure. "Novak's trial proceeds tomorrow. You will remain here, and no one will hear your sudden, miraculous recovery. Who would believe you over me, a hysterical girl against the most respected judge in the territory?" With that, he turned and left, locking the door behind him once more. Alone again, Abigail sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face as she confronted the terrible reality of her situation. Yates was imprisoned, facing execution for nothing more than helping her find her voice literally and figuratively. And now that she had found it again, there was no one to hear her. But as the initial shock and despair began to subside, determination took its place. She had been helpless once before, when her mother died and her father's cruelty had silenced her. She refused to be helpless now, not when Yates' life hung in the balance. Rising to her feet, Abigail began to plan. The courthouse of Bentonville stood imposing in the morning light as townsfolk gathered for what promised to be the most sensational trial in the town's history. Judge Elijah Gardner's daughter had been corrupted by a drifting cowboy, or so the whispered story went, and justice would be swift and severe. Inside, Yates Novak stood in the defendant's box, his expression impassive as the charges were read. He had refused the services of the court-appointed lawyer, choosing instead to represent himself. Judge Gardner presided, his customary black robes lending him an air of ominous authority as he looked down upon the man he believed had defiled his daughter. "How do you plead to these charges?" he demanded after the clerk finished reading the list of alleged offenses. "Not guilty," Yates replied clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. Judge Gardner's mouth tightened. "The evidence suggests otherwise, Mr. Novak. We have found numerous notes in your possession written by my daughter, as well as a journal documenting your encounters." "I don't deny corresponding with Miss Gardner," Yates stated calmly, "nor meeting with her. I deny any wrongdoing in those actions." A murmur ran through the courtroom at his boldness. "You took advantage of a mute, vulnerable young woman," the judge countered, his voice rising. "You encouraged her to deceive her family and meet you in secret. These are serious offenses." "Miss Gardner is not mute," Yates replied evenly. "Nor is she incapable of making her own decisions. She chose to meet with me because I offered her something no one else in this town has: respect for her intelligence and recognition of her right to express herself." The judge's face darkened. "You presume to know my daughter better than I do after a few months of clandestine meetings." "I know that she has a voice," Yates answered, his gaze steady. "One that was silenced not by illness or divine intervention, as you've led this town to believe, but by fear." Gasps and whispers erupted throughout the courtroom. Judge Gardner banged his gavel for order, his face flushed with anger. "These accusations are absurd and irrelevant to the charges at hand," he declared. "This court will hear evidence only as it pertains to the defendant's crimes." At that moment, the doors at the back of the courtroom crashed open. Every head turned to see Abigail Gardner standing in the doorway, pale but determined, with Martha hovering anxiously behind her. "Abigail," the judge exclaimed in surprise and anger, "you were instructed to remain at home." All eyes followed her as she walked steadily down the center aisle toward the front of the courtroom. She had spent the night practicing, forcing painful words past her disused vocal cords, preparing for this moment. Martha, shocked by her sudden ability to speak and horrified by the implications of what Abigail had told her, had finally agreed to help her escape her locked room. Stopping before the judge's bench, Abigail looked directly at her father, then turned to face the crowded courtroom. When she spoke, her voice was rough and quiet, but in the stunned silence of the room, every word was audible. "My name is Abigail Gardner," she began, each word carefully formed. "For 5 years I have been silent, not because I could not speak, but because I was not permitted to." The courtroom erupted in shocked exclamations. Judge Gardner pounded his gavel furiously. "This is preposterous," he shouted above the noise. "My daughter is confused and has been manipulated by the defendant." "No, Father," Abigail continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You are the one who manipulated me, and everyone else. You told them I was afflicted, when really you just couldn't bear to hear opinions that differed from your own. She turned to address the spectators directly. After my mother died, my father struck me. Whenever I spoke without permission, eventually I stopped speaking altogether, because it was safer. The silence in the courtroom now was complete and horrified. Even those who had respected Judge Gardner were visibly shaken by Abigail's words and by the undeniable fact that she long believed Mute was speaking. Mr. Novak committed no crime, she continued. He simply encouraged me to communicate, in writing at first and then helped me find my voice again. He showed me kindness, when others showed only pity. Judge Gardner had gone deathly pale, his authority visibly crumbling as the truth emerged. This is a fabrication, he insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. She's been coached by the defendant. Widow Miller stood up from her seat among the spectators. It's no fabrication, Elijah. I've watched these past months as this young man helped your daughter heal from the wounds you inflicted. She came to my property of her own free will, seeking what you denied her simple human dignity. Others began to stand Mrs. Jenkins from the bookshop, the pastor's wife who had not seen Abigail on the days she claimed to be visiting. Martha herself, who stepped forward to confirm that the judge had indeed locked his daughter away when he discovered her correspondence. As the testimonies mounted, Sheriff Dawson moved slowly from his position near the door, approaching the judge's bench with evident reluctance. I think we need to adjourn this proceeding, Judge, he said quietly. There are questions that need to be addressed before we can continue. Judge Gardner looked around wildly, seeing his carefully constructed world of respect and authority collapsing around him. This is absurd, he blustered. I am the law in this town. You cannot— Not anymore, Elijah, Sheriff Dawson interrupted firmly. Not after this. He turned to address the bailiff. Release Mr. Novak. The charges are being dropped pending further investigation. The bailiff hesitated, looking to the judge for confirmation. Do it, Dawson insisted, or I'll do it myself. As the bailiff moved to unlock the defendant's box, Judge Gardner rose from his seat in fury. This is insurrection. I will not allow— Sit down, Father, Abigail said, her voice quiet but carrying an authority that silenced him instantly. For once in your life, listen instead of commanding. To the astonishment of everyone present, Judge Gardner sank back into his chair, seemingly deflated by his daughter's newfound strength. Yates stepped out of the defendant's box and moved to Abigail's side, careful not to touch her in the public setting, but standing close enough that his support was evident. I suggest we continue this discussion in private, Sheriff Dawson said, addressing both Abigail and her father. There's been enough public spectacle for one day. As the crowd reluctantly began to disperse, buzzing with the shocking revelations they had witnessed, Abigail felt a strange lightness despite the gravity of the situation. For the first time in 5 years, she had spoken her truth aloud, and though her voice was rough and her words came slowly, they had been heard, in the sheriff's office, away from the prying eyes and ears of the townspeople. Abigail faced her father across a scarred wooden desk. Sheriff Dawson sat behind it, while Yates remained by Abigail's side, a silent source of strength. What happens now? Abigail asked, each word still an effort but coming more easily with practice. Sheriff Dawson sighed heavily. That depends on a number of factors, Miss Gardner. Your father's position in this community is complicated. He abused his authority, Yates stated flatly. Both as a father and as a judge, Judge Gardner, who had maintained a stony silence since leaving the courtroom, finally spoke. You understand nothing of my responsibilities, he said coldly. Everything I did was to protect my daughter and uphold the standards this community depends upon. By silencing me, Abigail challenged, by making me afraid to speak. Something flickered across her father's face, not quite remorse, but perhaps recognition. Your mother's defiance destroyed our family, he said quietly. Her insistence on speaking out, on challenging authority, it brought her nothing but grief. I didn't want that for you. Mother died of fever, Abigail countered, not from speaking her mind. She caught that fever riding in the rain to a suffragist meeting I had forbidden her to attend, her father revealed, his voice tight with old anger. Her disobedience killed her as surely as the disease. The revelation hung heavy in the small office. Abigail felt the weight of it, her father's twisted logic, his genuine if distorted belief that he had been protecting her. That doesn't justify what you did to me, she said finally. No, Sheriff Dawson agreed. It doesn't. Judge Gardner, given the public nature of today's revelations, I don't see how you can continue in your position. The territorial governor will need to be informed. The judge's face hardened. On what charges? Disciplining my own daughter. No court would convict me. Perhaps not, the sheriff conceded. But your authority in this town is finished, Elijah. You know that as well as I do. A tense silence followed this pronouncement. Then Judge Gardner looked directly at his daughter for the first time since they had left the courtroom. What do you want, Abigail? He asked, his voice stripped of its usual command. The question took her by surprise. Never in her memory had her father asked what she wanted. She considered carefully before answering. I want my freedom, she said simply. I want to live my own life without fear. Her father nodded slowly. And him, he asked, gesturing toward Yates. Is he part of this? Freedom you seek? Abigail glanced at Yates, seeing in his steady gaze the same question. That's for us to decide, she replied. Not you. After another long moment, Judge Gardner seemed to come to a decision. I will resign my position, he said flatly, and I will leave Bentonville. The house and your mother's inheritance will transfer to you, as should have happened when you turned 20. He looked at Sheriff Dawson. Draw up the necessary papers. I'll sign them before I go. The simplicity of this capitulation after years of absolute control left Abigail momentarily speechless. She had expected a longer fight, more resistance. Why now? She asked finally. Her father's expression was unreadable. Because I recognize defeat when I see it. He stood, straightening his coat with dignity despite his fallen position. I'll return to the house to collect my personal belongings. The rest I leave to you. With that, he walked out of the sheriff's office, his shoulders straight but something broken in his bearing that had not been there before. Sheriff Dawson exhaled heavily. Well, that was unexpected. He looked at Abigail with genuine concern. Will you be all right, Miss Gardner? This is a lot of change very suddenly. I've been waiting for change for 5 years, she replied, her voice growing stronger with practice. I'll manage. She won't be alone, Yates added quietly. The sheriff nodded. I'll see to the paperwork then. And I'll have one of my deputies keep an eye on the judge until he leaves town, just to be safe. When they were finally alone outside the sheriff's office, standing in the late afternoon sunlight, Abigail felt the enormity of the day's events wash over her. Her legs suddenly unsteady, she reached for Yates' arm. Are you all right? He asked, concern evident in his face. She nodded, then managed a small smile. My voice hurts, but my heart doesn't, not anymore. Yates covered her hand with his own where it rested on his arm. You were magnificent in there, the bravest person I've ever known. What happens now? She asked, echoing her earlier question to her father but with a different meaning entirely. That depends on you, Yates replied. You have your freedom now. What do you want to do with it? Abigail considered the question seriously. After so long being told what to do, what to think, how to behave, The expanse of possibility before her was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I want to learn," she said finally. "To read more books, to see more of the world than just Bentonville. And—" She hesitated, then continued with newfound boldness. "I want you to be part of that if you want to be." Yates' expression softened. "I've been wandering most of my life, Abigail, never staying in one place, never belonging anywhere, but these past months with you. For the first time, I've found something worth staying for." The words hung between them, full of promise and possibility. In the middle of Bentonville's Main Street, with townsfolk still buzzing about the day's dramatic events, Yates Novak took Abigail Gardner's hands in his and made a declaration that once would have seemed impossible. "I love you," he said simply. "Not just your words or your silence, but everything that you are." Abigail felt tears spring to her eyes, not tears of fear or pain as she had shed so often in the past 5 years, but tears of joy and wonder. "I love you too," she whispered, the words still new and precious on her tongue. Spring arrived in Bentonville with a riot of wildflowers and fresh beginnings. 6 months had passed since the dramatic courtroom scene that had changed everything, and the town had gradually adjusted to the absence of Judge Gardner, who had departed for Denver the day after his resignation. The large house on the hill had undergone its own transformation. Under Abigail's direction, the dark, oppressive furnishings had been replaced with lighter colors and comfortable arrangements. Windows that had been perpetually shuttered were thrown open to admit sunshine and fresh air. Most significantly, the house now rang with voices: Abigail's, growing stronger each day, and Yates', warm and steady beside her. They had married in a simple ceremony in February, with Widow Miller, Mrs. Jenkins, and a few other friends in attendance. The town had watched with interest and generally growing approval as the strange, silent daughter of the former judge found her voice and her happiness with the cowboy, who had once been accused of corrupting her. On this particular morning, Abigail sat on the porch, a book open in her lap, enjoying the warmth of the spring sunshine. Her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined a year earlier. After her father's departure, she had discovered a talent for numbers and organization, and now helped several local businesses with their accounts. Her voice, though still sometimes hesitant, had returned fully, allowing her to speak, laugh, and even sing softly when she thought no one was listening. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the lane, where Yates was returning from his morning rounds. After settling in Bentonville, he had established a small but successful horse training business, using the skills he had learned in his years of wandering to gentle even the most difficult animals. "Good morning, Mrs. Novak," he called as he dismounted, his smile warming her as surely as the spring sunshine. "Good morning yourself, Mr. Novak," she replied, setting aside her book to greet him. He bounded up the steps and leaned down to kiss her, a gesture that still sent a thrill through her after months of marriage. "Any news from town?" he asked, settling into the chair beside hers. "Mrs. Jenkins stopped by with a new shipment of books," Abigail answered. "And she mentioned that the governor's office has finally appointed a new judge, someone from Cheyenne with a good reputation, apparently." Yates nodded thoughtfully. "That's good news for the town." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching a pair of bluebirds flitting among the newly budded trees. "I've been thinking," Abigail said eventually, her voice growing more confident with each passing day, "about what you said before we were married about showing me more of the world beyond Bentonville." Yates turned to her with interest. "Oh, I think I'm ready for that now," she continued. "Not to leave permanently, but to travel a little, perhaps to Denver or even San Francisco." To see mountains and oceans and all the things you've told me about. A slow smile spread across Yates' face. I think that could be arranged. The horses are well trained and Jenkins' boy could look after them for a few weeks. He took her hand, his expression growing serious. Are you sure you're ready? It's a big world out there. Abigail nodded firmly. I spent too many years afraid to speak, afraid to live. I don't want to waste any more time in fear. Then we'll go, he decided. Once the weather is fully settled, we'll take the train west. I'll show you the mountains at sunset and the desert at dawn. We'll see the ocean and watch ships come in from places we can only imagine. The excitement in his voice matched the feeling expanding in her chest. The girl who had been silenced for so long would now have a world of experiences to give voice to. I have something else to tell you, Abigail said, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her still flat stomach. Something that might affect our travel plans, but in the best possible way. Yates' eyes widened as understanding dawned. Are you certain? He asked, his voice suddenly hushed with wonder. She nodded, joy bubbling up inside her. Dr. Morrison confirmed it yesterday. By winter, there will be 3 of us in this house. In an instant, Yates was kneeling before her chair, his hands cradling hers, his eyes bright with emotion. A child, he whispered. Our child. A child who will never know silence as I did, Abigail promised. Who will grow up surrounded by words and stories and songs. Yates rose and gathered her gently into his arms. And who will have the bravest mother in all of Wyoming territory to learn from? As they stood together on the porch of what had once been a house of silence and fear, now transformed into a home of love and possibility, Abigail reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the frightened, voiceless girl she had been to the woman who had found her strength, her voice, and her future, all because a passing cowboy had recognized the truth behind her silence and given her the courage to break it. I love you, she said, the words flowing easily now, precious in their simplicity. And I love you, Yates replied, his arms tightening around her. Every word you speak and all the ones yet to come. In the years that followed, Abigail and Yates Novak became fixtures in Bentonville, respected and well-liked by most of the community. Their home, once the symbol of Judge Gardner's stern authority, became known instead for its open doors, lively conversations, and the laughter of children. Their first child, a son named William after Yates' long-deceased father, arrived that winter as predicted. He was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Emily, after Abigail's mother. Both children grew up in a household where words were treasured, stories were shared freely, and no voice was ever silenced. Abigail never heard from her father again, though occasionally news reached her of his life in Denver, where he had apparently remarried and established a legal practice. She sometimes wondered if he ever regretted what he had done to her, but found that, as the years passed, the question mattered less and less. What mattered was the life she had built from the broken pieces of her past, a life filled with love, purpose, and the sound of her own voice, freely given and joyfully received. What mattered was the man who had seen her worth when she was silenced, the children who would never know such silence, and the strength she had found within herself to speak her truth at last. And if sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and Yates sat beside her on the porch watching the sunset, Abigail found herself thinking of that first scrap of paper she had hidden in a hollow oak. I have not always been silent. It was only to marvel at how far she had come, and how beautifully, how fully, she had reclaimed her voice.